Across the causeway into Malaysia. Next, we have Ross Tapsell, who's an associate professor at the ANU's College of Asia and Pacific, and he's also the director of ANU's Malaysia Institute. He's obviously a well-known researcher and analyst on both Indonesian and Malaysian politics and state-society relationships, and well known, of course, for his work on the role of popular media in both those countries. So over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Jed. Thanks, everyone. As a second speaker of the afternoon session, I know that's, it's an opportunity I see to go a bit rogue and go left field. So I hope some of the lines are entertaining at least. Malaysia, 60 years of single-party dominance, followed by 4 changes of government in 4 years from 2018 to 2022. But over the last year, I've noticed there's a considerable spike in stories of Malaysia being at a crossroads. And I just wanted to start by saying, look, as someone who also works on Indonesia, it's one thing for you guys to compete around who has the nicest batik. It's another to compete on who has the tastiest rendang, but to compete on the line that Malaysia is now competing with Indonesia on being the country in Southeast Asia most at a crossroads, that is a new level of competition that I think is quite unfair. And I think now you can all go home. If you only remember one thing from a SSEAC event, you can remember that you go home to your families tonight and say, did you know Malaysia was at a crossroads? And say, is it? Yes, it is. But is it true? Is there an argument that Malaysia is at a crossroads? Well, that's, I think, a question worth answering over the next 20 minutes, as we are roughly halfway through the Anwar government's 5-year term. But first, a very quick recap, and I'll speed through this because we don't want to go too far back in history. But in the last election, there were 3 coalitions. Anwar Ibrahim's multiracial pluralist coalition, the Perikatan Nasional, a coalition of right-wing Malay supremacist parties, including PAS, the Pan-Malaysian Islamic Party, focused on Islamic fundamentalism. And finally, the Barisan Nasional, a coalition of centre and right-wing parties that ruled Malaysia for 60 years. At the end of that, there was no clear winner. Anwar Ibrahim's party, a coalition, had the most seats in parliament, followed very closely by the Perikatan Nasional, the Islamists. That left the Barisan Nasional with a terrible result, only 30 seats, but ultimately the kingmaker in deciding who they should form a government with. In the aftermath of the election, Anwar Ibrahim and Zahid Hamidi, the leader of Barisan Nasional, sat around in backroom meetings on some pretty ugly couches and had a discussion about forming government. The king was in favour of this, thought this was a fantastic idea, and a government was formed. That left Perikatan Nasional in opposition, forming a shadow cabinet. No, it wasn't a shadow cabinet. They didn't want to call it a shadow cabinet. They called it something else. But ultimately, that was the end result. Anwar Ibrahim, after 20 years of trying to be Prime Minister since the Reformasi days, finally achieves his goal. The big questions that remain that I think we need to discuss, which are now relevant still today, 3 years on, was how significant was the success of the Islamist Malay nationalist campaign by the Perikatan Nasional, and PAS in particular, which won the most seats in Parliament, 49, and G15, of any party. The question that everybody was asking is, well, previous governments haven't lasted very long over the last 4 years. Can Anwar's government last? And then UMNO, soundly rejected in 2018, spectacularly for the first time, and then again in 2022 by voters, remains key to government and in government. And how problematic is that? And finally, how democratic is Malaysia becoming? So to the first question, to the Islamists. There's little doubt that there's growing support for Malay Muslim hegemonic politics in a large section of Malaysian society. But in the 3 years since the election, analysts and scholars really still have no consensus about how meaningful PAS's victory in particular was. Was it a flash in the pan? Was it simply an anti-UMNO vote? Or is there a new powerful Malay nativist movement rising in tandem with political Islam? We could debate this all afternoon, and we don't have time, but whether lasting or not, undoubtedly the so-called green wave of PAS's success in 2022, PAS's flag is green, so the term was used as green wave, and the subsequent by-election results is being taken very seriously by Anwar's government, and in turn leading to a heightened insecurity in the eyes of the government around its legitimacy amongst Malay Muslim constituents. The most obvious response here is the freezing of opposition party Bersatu's bank accounts, which contain about $70 million. But other initiatives have come in the form of online crackdowns. Last year, Malaysia led the world in the amount of TikTok takedown requests, which I know TikTok is not particularly happy about. TikTok takedown requests, it's hard to say that 5 times. There's also been a growth in budget for ministries to hire influencers and cyber troopers, a greater role for government communications bodies to become more propaganda outlets, and introduction of laws around social media, which have been criticised by media rights groups. The pro-Islamists, however, are still shaping online narratives around culture war issues, a long tradition in Malaysia where a particular case or incident occurs and goes viral, which inflames racial and religious tensions, fires up the online warriors that Islam is under threat, and generally leads to a concession pandering to right-wing Islamist interests. I won't go into all of them now. You can see a list of them there. That list is pretty long. But the point being, the Anwar government is adopting a more aggressive stance against protecting Malay Muslim privileges from perceived threats. The other point being is that PAS from opposition seems to have more control over how the government reacts and responds, more power than the multiracial Malaysian Chinese-dominated DAP, who has the most seats in the government. Because to Anwar, the urbanised, pluralist, non-Malay voters are in the bag. Where else are they going to go? And the key is to win over more conservative Malays. For PAS and Perikatan Nasional, victory in the next election can only be achieved if a significant majority of Malay voters decide to choose a Malay-first, more Islamist coalition. And ultimately, that probably means an alliance with UMNO again being the key to power. Which brings us to the centrist right, former party in power for 60 years, party UMNO. The question of whether Anwar government can survive is so far a resounding yes. Anwar, more than any other modern leader in ASEAN, understands the importance of politics being the art of compromise. He and Zahid clearly get on, dating from their time back to Reformasi days and in UMNO together. And Zahid has pretty much gotten what he wants in terms of cabinet posts, acquittal of his corruption cases, Najib Razak remaining in jail, but some concessions made, UMNO treated generally as an equal partner when it comes to alliances and agreements in by-elections and so on. The problem, of course, is that UMNO has been rejected twice by Malaysian voters in the last 2 elections, but in the 7 years since that first momentous election loss, they've spent only 2 years in opposition, having manufactured a coup described as the Sheraton move. I love the idea of naming coups after hotels. I think Thailand should, we could make this. Australia could do that too when there's a change in government, the Northbourne Avenue Hotel or something, or where was it? Anyway, UMNO manufactured a coup to get back in power in 2020, and despite having a pitiful 30 seats in the last election, is in government again, which naturally leads to a lot of disillusionment amongst the millions of voters who soundly rejected them, many twice, and a belief that democracy is not working in the interests of the people. Anwar, the leader of the pro-democracy movement for over 2 decades, is undoubtedly disappointing Malaysia's wanting reform. Bersay, Malaysia's famous reform-seeking NGO coalition, gave Anwar a score of D in 2024. But it is up from an F in 2023, though. I guess proving that the pressure not to fail students isn't just at universities, but it's in NGOs as well. So to Anwar, this is not to say that there are no successes of the Anwar government. There is much to be positive about. The economy remains steady. It's growing at a reasonable 5%. Anwar's strengths in foreign policy suggest he's a skilled operator in navigating Trump's tariffs, securing more foreign investment, and generally positioning Malaysia as a beacon of stability and reliability for trade and investment at a time of global uncertainty in the US. In April this year, Anwar hosted Xi Jinping in Kuala Lumpur, a sign of close ties, given that the only other ASEAN countries Xi visited were Cambodia and Vietnam, and it's been over a decade since Xi has visited Malaysia. Malaysia's role as chair in ASEAN is seeing it receive plenty of attention, including from Australia, who sees ASEAN as a crucial bulwark to China, perhaps problematically, but we can talk about that later. And in the sign of the strategic forward thinking in this year's ASEAN conference held in KL, there was the inaugural ASEAN-China GCC, the Cooperation Council for Islamic States of the Gulf. Did you get that? Cooperation Council for Islamic State, that's the GCC, which led Anwar to claim that this was the best ASEAN summit in its history, which I kind of imagine him saying that with Trump's voice. You know, it was the best ASEAN I've ever seen. It was the greatest ASEAN. The people of the Gulf, they're beautiful countries. It's a beautiful country, the Gulf. They give me a jet. So Malaysian politicians have long sold themselves in the West as we are Singapore, but at a discount. But even that's changing. Even that's changing in the trade war and Chinese hegemony. Malaysia is essentially saying we need to shift our focus and sell ourselves as a bridge between the growth areas of trade and business between China and the Middle East. As one Malaysian official said recently, we used to look at UK and US to study and start businesses. We're looking much more towards North Asia now. And Anwar, ever the Islamic leader turned cosmopolitan statesman, is a good man to sell this message. The Malaysian king is clearly supportive of the Anwar government, last week making a statement not to politicise sensitive issues. And Anwar is also trying desperately to manage political parties in Borneo who have been calling on greater financial rewards from natural resources, all of which is currently heating up as we head towards state elections in Sabah later this year. So in short, Anwar's doing pretty well. He's juggling the demands of UMNO, Xi Jinping, ASEAN, Sabah and Sarawak autonomy claims, a hostile opposition, global uncertainty around Trump's tariffs, and as has been the case for almost his entire career, he's currently concerned with the lawsuit started by a former aide who is claiming sexual assault. But at least in his own party, it's a beacon of stability, right? Everything's great in the PKR. Not quite. Last month, in the lead up to his party's elections, for a variety of reasons, Anwar ended up pulling strings internally to promote his daughter, Nurul Izzah, Malaysia's Reformasi princess, as the new deputy leader of the party. Izzah lost her seat in the last election, but has been active in government policy and politicking. She replaces the formidable but polarising Rafizi Ramli as deputy. Rafizi and another senior minister promptly resigned, leading the media to say the Anwar government is, yes, you guessed it, at a crossroads. Rafizi is a man who no doubt sees himself as next in line as party leader after Anwar and a future prime minister. Here's a clip I've got of Rafizi not taking the loss so well, and a shout out to any of you who are just out of a recent relationship breakup. This one's for you. We need each other to have to go. Time. He's taking it well. Never wanted to be prime minister anyway. Now, Anwar has a history of disappointing those who think he's next in, think that they're next in line, and the election of Nurul Izzah has led to the concerns of nepotism. But Izzah is a formidable politician with years of experience who has the ability to rally a crowd, push for reforms, including for Malaysian women and non-Malays, and would by no means be an ineffective leader. In other words, for any Indonesians in the audience, she's no Gibran. Now, I'll show you, sorry, don't need to see it. Let me just, I want to show you a TikTok. It's always a challenge to try and get TikTok up, but I want to show you a TikTok of Nurul Izzah. Which she has put forward. And I'll very quickly translate. Apologies for the rough translation. Politics is, they say politics is not for women like me. They say I don't deserve to be here. When my father was jailed, one by one, the doors closed. University whose shoes belong to the youth. They call it nepotism. But I've never used force. Every step I take myself on the road, main road, amongst a sea of people, for the people who are truly keadilan, not behind a wall of power, but in the real world.
Bukan tentang jawatan.
because this is not about
Ini
position.
perjuangan.
This is about struggle.
Ini tentang Malaysia.
This is about Malaysia. Now, I don't want to overstate a TikTok video. It's easy to do these things, but I do want to put this question to you. How many sons of Southeast Asian politicians, male heirs that is, would address the issue of nepotism so directly and compellingly? How many would even feel the need to? So at some point, if Izzah was going to take on a role of the higher levels of power, she was going to have to face this issue of nepotism, and better to do it now as PKR deputy than later as a potential prime ministerial candidate. So watch this space, I guess. However, as we all know in Southeast Asian politics, positioning one's offspring as a leader for the future doesn't necessarily mean you are willing to stand down yourself anytime soon. Which reminds me, I haven't talked about Mahathir, but do we have time about? We don't have time. We don't have time. No time. We don't have time for Mahathir, which is pretty much how Malaysians feel at the moment about Mahathir. They don't. Anwar intends on a second term. Indeed, the implicit message is, if you want serious reforms, I need a bigger mandate. Get me in power with a larger majority in 2020 in the next election, and you'll see the real Anwar. It's a nice message, but it is, of course, a typical politician's message, and in a way, very typically Anwar. And so finally to democracy. Malaysia has undoubtedly made extraordinary gains in democratic process since the first ever change of government in 2018. It's been a rocky road, and one without serious political violence, economic crisis, or breakdown of social cohesion. In fact, over the last year, we've seen parliamentary select committees having more power, attempts at bipartisan-led reforms. The media industry, where I spend a lot of my time, is much more vibrant than it ever was. Corruption cases are being investigated, even if it's not perfect. And Malaysians may be sceptical that Parliament is working for them, but they are becoming more used to a less authoritarian system. And compared to the democratic declines of the Philippines and Indonesia, with neo-authoritarian leaders winning elections with supermajorities, for now, Malaysia's highly competitive political environment is a place of serious open contestation and healthy unpredictability, allowing parties to woo a growing cohort of swing voters, potentially with policy reforms. Now, of course, the age-old problem of Malaysian politics, the dominance of race and religion, in particular political parties differentiating themselves on that one main issue, the role of Islam in the state, will continue to be the veneer covering the political landscape. And so to misquote McLuhan, you can suppress the medium of TikTok and the like, but how do you suppress the message? Might be the question for Anwar. Furthermore, as pollsters tell me, many rural and semi-rural Malaysians view democracy is intricately tied to the state of the economy. Over the past 7 years, despite all the changes, the main correlation to how voters view how democracy is going is the health of the economy. When the economy was slowing, Malaysians were disappointed in the democracy. At the moment, the economy is doing okay. Generally, people think Anwar's doing okay and views of democracy are okay. So over 25 years since Anwar helped start the Reformasi movement, now finally achieving his goal of becoming Prime Minister, there's little sign that he is changing the key pillars which are the foundation of Malaysian politics. So at least for this one in 2025, for this SSEAC, for now, it's a case of another year of stability. But for how long is anyone's guess. Thanks, that's all.
Thanks, Ross. I'm sure when I went to Malaysia for a short stay 20 years ago, I found a book in the library to read beforehand, maybe by Jim Baker, Malaysia at a Crossroads. I'm glad to see not too much has changed. So we do have 10 minutes for Q&A here, again, for Ross. Thank you again for not only an informative but an entertaining presentation. Always good at this time of the afternoon. Do we have the microphones going around? We have 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ross, for your presentations. So we can see that now Pakatan Harapan, Barisan Nasional, and Gabungan Parti Sarawak and Gabungan Rakyat Sabah, they form a big government in the federal state. And now for the Pilihan Raya Negeri in Sabah, they going to be to form a new, the remain coalitions in the regional election. Do you think that in the upcoming general election, they will remain on the same coalitions? Because we can see if Pakatan Harapan competing, then Barisan Nasional will not competing.
Yeah.
When Barisan Nasional competing, Pakatan Harapan will not competing. What do you think about that? Yeah.
Right. So for the audience not super into this, so there's Sabah state elections, Sabah and Sarawak, of course, the Borneo states of Malaysia, which and these upcoming elections are a real test for a coalition government, because obviously any coalition government, they form a coalition at the time, but then once there's a state election or a by-election, suddenly the gloves come off and there's fighting over, who gets nominated and so on, who gets formed. I guess the key point is all of this is happening right now as we speak. There's internal party discussions. There's even this morning in the newspaper, I read the Chief Minister of Sabah basically saying the problem with Sabah at the moment is that it's not stable. We want to be more like Sarawak, which is quite incredible that in a way that the Sabahans would look to Sarawak, who is a much less democratic, sort of far less competitive election process, and say, actually, we want to be more like that. But in a nutshell, I don't know what's going to happen in the Sabah election, but I do know that over the past 10 years working on Malaysia, whoever is a political analyst, a Malaysian political analyst, will tell me this election, this next one, will tell us exactly how Malaysia's democracy and political party political party alliances will form. And I'm always skeptical that this next election is going to be the one that sort of solves the riddle of Malaysian politics.
Thanks, Ross. I wonder what James Chin will say from Tasmania. He's from Kuching. He always emphasized on the referendum at 63. On that same line of Sabah, the people in West Malaysia has never liked the parties in West Malaysia. PAS and UMNO will never get a stronghold. Do you think, and now Sabah and Sarawak are in a more capable position of determining their rights? They have got more, say, in petroleum. Do you think that they will split away from the coalition?
You mean, will Sabah and Sarawak become, like you're talking about the MA63 agreement, they're going to become more independent states, or do you mean that there'll be a political split in whatever I think? Yeah. Can I also plug, I'm sorry to shamelessly plug, but the ANU, my university, has a Malaysia update on the 1st of August down in Canberra. So please come, because we'll be discussing these issues. And James Chin will be speaking, so you can hear what James Chin says about Sabah and Sarawak. Look, I think the point of just the Sabah Sarawak parties and politicians wanting more autonomy and wanting more financial resources, which the Petronas case is a good example of this, is definitely the underlying movement of power constellations going on at the moment in Malaysia. So as I said, this is a challenge for Anwar to now. He's trying to maintain a coalition, and he's trying to keep these parties on side, and he's trying to eventually, win more influence in Borneo. But it's a very difficult challenge when a lot of the Borneo voters are looking at the peninsula and saying, we are not getting enough of state funds, and we're essentially being left out of the decision-making, a lot of processes. So there's definitely this movement towards greater autonomy, perhaps even independence for Sabah and Sarawak. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but there's definitely, an underlying push for that.
Where was the third hand before? Just here, I think. Yeah. Lydia.
Thanks, Ross, for mentioning or noting the economy as being the underlying material indicator of, I guess, political progress or lack thereof. I suppose I was interested to hear if you could elaborate a bit more on how you think, at a time especially when globalization's been dismantled, and of course, Malaysia having been a key beneficiary actually over the last few decades of globalization, and with this sort of uncertainty, trade wars, all sorts of regional tensions, that how Malaysia is going to deal with what actually is an economy at a critical crossroads, where its business model, if you like, is currently very uncertain. And Anwar's government's arguably best economic policy wonk, Rafizi, has quit cabinet after he lost the party elections against Nurul Izzah.
Thanks. So, and a really good point to just have just a minute on the economy. And one thing I think which really highlights this is the Malaysian government at the moment is quite proud of itself. I think they said that the unemployment is as low as it's been in 10 years, around about 3%, 3.1% unemployment. Youth unemployment is over 10%. So it's hiding this underlying problem, which is that a lot of young people, particularly students, and particularly people looking to get a job after school or university, or then buy a house and so on, are concerned about the future of the country and feel that the economy is not working for them. Back to your point about globalization. So there is this problem that people like Rafizi could speak to young people, and he could articulate the concerns of younger Malaysians in ways that perhaps other politicians couldn't. The Muda Party, the youth party, which started out with some success, is dwindling, and the former leader has had his own trouble. So that leads us to wonder what is going to be a future for Malaysia at a time where the Malaysian government spruiks things. For example, at the moment, they're saying technology, we're doing really well in technology. But what they really mean by that is a lot of data centers in Cyberjaya are doing quite well. That doesn't mean that young people are getting jobs in, startups and are going to end up in Silicon Valley or in, in a exciting new, highly paid tech industry. So this is this disparity between young and old, and also another thing is urban and rural.
All right. Thank you very much, Ross, for the
Thanks.
presentation.
Yep.